Check. Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Varun. I'm one of the co-founders and VP of products at 2 Big Years, the product development, and we develop a range of audio tech and tools for VR, AR, and what we're going to talk about today, cinematic VR. And this is JP. He's head of sound at Headspace Studio. They're a studio dedicated to developing great audio for virtual reality, and he's also director of sound technology at Felix and Paul Studios, which you should have heard of. So today's talk is really about post-production for cinematic VR, and from an audio perspective, ranging from the tools all the way down to the creative bits of it, the terminology, the ideas, and some of the concepts that we can use to actually start defining this medium and really starting to understand it. All of this starts with good workflow, because as creative people, we need the tools to actually get our vision out there. And with VR, it's very much the Wild West, as we know. We have got non-standard workflows, the different ways of doing things, and it's really difficult to share our work and to work together. And one of the main things that has to be tackled quickly and is already being tackled is having tools that help you share your projects, work together, and craft better experiences for the medium. And it's really important for the tools and the underlying technology to push the technical and creative boundaries of the medium. There's so much that we don't understand, and the only way we can figure things out is by actually diving in and working our way through it. And the solution here is not about retrofitting existing technologies. It's not about taking a 5.1 audio mix and then just playing it back to a 360 video and saying, hey, VR is done. We really aren't making the most of what this medium has to offer. And the only way we can get there is by inventing, breaking, and learning constantly, and close collaboration between audio technology companies, creative practitioners, not just at the sound design level, but across the whole sort of creative stack. So cinematic VR, as it stands now, does have a way around that. There are tools developed by companies like ours and many others, which helps you either use game audio tools or use existing audio workstations to where your existing workflows are augmented, where you've got a suite of plugins, you can position sounds in 3D space, but most importantly, mixed directly to a VR device. It cuts down the barriers, cuts down the friction points, and you've got this closed iterative loop where you can directly mix to a VR device and 360 video and ensure that your mix sounds really good, while also constantly dealing with a range of input formats, whether it's ambisonics, mono stereo, your sound effects, music, whatnot, spatialized, non-spatialized audio, and still be able to render this experience in a VR app across devices, across platforms, across systems. It's a fragmented, it's the start of an ecosystem, and it's already quite fragmented, and it's important to be able to bridge this gap as much as possible. But the workflow by itself doesn't exist by itself. It's based on things that we've all learned in game audio, in the long history of cinema, over 70, 80 years of things that we've learned with workflow tools and so on. And I think it's safe to say at this point that we're borrowing the best of each of these mediums and trying to create something that's a combination of both. So if you look at cinematic VR workflow as it stands now, if you're using an audio workstation, you mix directly to a device, you preview your mix directly on a VR device, and then you export it out into a format which is then recreated within your VR application or your target platform. On a very high level, game audio is quite similar. You use an audio middleware tool with the game engine, and you preview your mix and your sounds in-game, and you get real-time feedback on what it's like, and once you're done with it, you export it out into sound banks, and the sound banks are then loaded up into your game, and based on events within your game, you hear those sounds. But the key differentiator here is if you're working with the game engine or with a game-like system, the game engine has a lot of information about the scene. It's sort of got this overarching knowledge of what is happening. And that makes things a lot more simpler in many cases, because you've got all this metadata where objects exist in space, where sounds need to be played back. But when you're working with cinematic VR, and especially live action experiences, you don't have any of this data. At least at this point, we don't have the technology to make it happen. So we are very reliant on post-production workflows to actually rebuild that soundscape as it should be heard. But what is really interesting here for me, technologically, and for a lot of people working in this area, is the combination of both these worlds. It's about drawing the bridge across, creating the bridge across game-like experiences and cinematic-like experiences. We'll talk about this in a bit. And these experiences extend beyond the technicalities into the creative domain as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Varun. So as he explained, while there are many similarities between film, sound, and game sound, there's also significant differences that warrant care in the transfer of concepts and theory into cinematic VR. So the first thing I think that's important to define is the word we hear all the time when we speak about VR, is presence. So we hear a lot about immersion, we hear about presence, and people seem to use those two words absolutely interchangeably. So Varun just spoke about the tools, the workflow, and what's important to understand is that's what immersion is. So immersion is something you can, it's objective. It's something that you deliver. It's technical. It's something you can measure. And according to presence theories, presence is proportional to the level of immersion achieved in the technology. And this is proportional to the level of realism achieved. Of course, what tools like 2D Gear's Spatial Workstation allow you to achieve is a very high level of realism. But although immersive audio is a crucial element to achieving presence, along with cinematography, blocking, acting, etc., it's not just about using positional audio. Now, we sometimes hear about people say, hey, you know what, I got this great ambisonic mic, and you know, that's it. If I can put it in my pipeline, and that's what it outputs, that's it, I'm done. And I don't think you would hear people say this about a movie. Everyone knows that there's a lot of craft, a lot of technique, a lot of artistic knowledge put into films to build this whole soundscape that often 98, 99% of the sound you hear was fabricated and recreated. So we need to be able to do the same things with cinematic VR. The second concept, I think, which is important to tackle and understand if you want to create a vocabulary for VR, is understanding what is the field of audition. So just as much as we have a field of view for visual, we have a field of audition. In VR, it sort of looks something like this. So it's a sphere. That's very different. Well, it's similar to gaming, but it sure is very different from what we have in traditional movies. So, of course, you have surround mixes where if you've mixed movies before, you'll put a bit of reverb out there, a few ambiances, but you're not really mixing for a sphere, and you sure don't have elevation, except for some movies which get mixed in something like Dolby Atmos, for instance, or Auro 3D. But it's really, surely ain't such immersive such as VR can get. So we talked about the field of view, and we see it here, for instance, where you have, in current HMDs, you have about 100 by 100 degrees of a field of view, and the audio that corresponds to that zone is called diegetic audio. That's a concept that borrowed from cinema. What that tells us, although, is that that's about only 30% of that sphere. So at any time, you only have only 30% of the audio you look at, you hear, you can also look at. Of course, you can turn around, but we're going to get to it. That's the second part of this sphere, which is called acousmatic sound. So acousmatic sound is also fully spatialized audio. It's everything you can hear, but you would have to turn around to actually associate what it corresponds to visually. Of course, we're going to talk about later on, but that's where audio cues will probably happen, which is a great tool for VR storytelling. The third component, again, borrowed from cinema, non or extra diegetic audio. So we're talking about scored music. I'm not talking about music that's being, playing in an environment like playing from an iFi or any sort that could be in the space, but also voiceover narration, which is also very, very important when you're dealing with cinematic experiences. That was very theoretical. Now that we have those two concepts, I'll try to get as practical as possible and show you examples from experiences I've had the chance to work on and give very real examples. So audio cues, we just mentioned it. My tip to you would be, if you're going to mix for VR, try to be subtle when using audio cues. You're working so hard to build that presence, but it's so easy to break if you're very, very obvious with your audio cues, saying, so the viewer is going to feel somehow manipulated and will be pulled out of the experience. So an example of I would say, fairly good use of audio cues. This is an experience I did with Felix and Paul Studios. There's a movie that's called Wild, so we did a companion experience for this with Reese Witherspoon and Laura Dern. And it's basically you're sitting on a rock. And so you see the character played by Reese walking by you, and she sits on a rock, takes off her pack-sack, and she turns around and looks at you, or actually through you. You don't really know. And her glance is pretty intense, and you're a few feet away from Reese Witherspoon, so basically you want to stay there. And, but at that exact moment, the directors wanted you to turn around on the other side, because if you've seen the movie, the character played by Laura Dern is actually her deceased mother. And at that precise moment, if you turn around, she appears. So what could we do to incite you to turn around? We went for very subtle things, but it actually works quite well. So at that precise moment, you have a bird fly over you, going towards the forest in your back, and there's also wind starting to blow behind you in the forest. Now, it's so subtle, people don't actually notice it, but most of them turn around, and then you see the character played by Laura Dern, and she delivers that beautiful line. And so I think this is the kind of trick we're aiming for. Of course, if you're in a war experience for something really, really intense, you can go for explosion, but it's not always the case, right? The next thing I'd like to talk about is to give depth to the diegetic space. So give depth to your sound design. That really helps to induce presence. So the first ever experience we did was Strangers. So you're basically sitting in musician Patrick Watson, a great singer-songwriter in the vein of Radiohead, if you don't know him. Really good stuff. So you're in a studio, and he's playing a track for you, and the acoustics of that space are really nice, so fully positional. You turn around, there's the dog. But we did want to add a little bit of depth to that experience. So you see windows right at the back, and I thought, what if I just open one of those windows? Now, what happens is it actually lets the cityscape come into the experience. So you hear a bus drive by, you hear people on the street. So it tells you about way more than the limits of the room you are in. So these are great tricks to induce presence. The other important thing, if you're going for more complex experiences, and we know directors want to explore this medium, they want to have longer pieces and have multiple shots. So you know that cuts in VR are really hard to do, and you can, again, really easily break presence. And how are you going to support a narrative arc? We found out that audio is actually a very good tool for that. So in this experience called LeBron James, Striving for Greatness, this is one of the first shots of the experience. There's over 30 shots in that 12-minute experience. That's a lot of shots in quite a short period. So in that shot, you're in the gym with LeBron, and you realize that he's big. It's quite impressive if you've seen it. And there's music. There's a great Drake track playing in that gym. So that music is totally diegetic. It's there. But then we move on to the following sequence where you're in that gym just with LeBron, and he's talking to you about what he's going through in that preseason training. Now, if we just cut from the previous scene to this one, it's really hard to support some kind of narrative arc. So the music that was diegetic before, now becomes extra diegetic. So it's a stereo track. It's there, but it just keeps that line going. And the same thing will happen with the next sequence, meaning now that you have LeBron talking to you, then next shot is him in a court playing basketball, but he will keep talking to you. His voice that was diegetic, that was right in front of you, is now a voiceover that's mono or stereo. But this is, I found, a good way to carry a storytelling arc. And there's 5 storytelling arcs in this piece. I think the most important thing I'd like to tell you is this is a new medium. Be creative. Try to fail. I don't know how many times, how many things we tried that didn't work, but the last time, let's realize that you've heard this before, but the last time there was a new medium around, it was the 1910s. And so this doesn't come very often, this great opportunity that we have now. So be brave, try, explore the medium, break it, see what it wants to go, where it wants to go. I'd like to continue on a few examples of areas where you can explore. This piece called New Wave, the director, Samir Malal, had this great idea. Was, what if you have this super simple thing? You're just there, right there, next to a beach. You've got this couple coming, and they're obviously fighting. So the guy comes next to the boat, and his girlfriend goes into the water. And what happens is if you turn towards the guy, you actually hear his inner speech, what he's thinking at that exact moment. And if you turn towards his girlfriend, you hear her own version. So that's something that wouldn't possibly happen in any other medium, and it's something that's highly personal because you decide what you're going to listen to, and it's on a different level. It's talking about miscommunication because you can't listen to both at the same time. So I think that's an interesting exploration of the medium. Another way to explore is with hardware. With technology. So in this piece for Jurassic World, as you can guess, this was the largest animal that ever walked on Earth, I believe. So you're this forest ranger, park ranger, and so when she, at some point she's eating leaves up there, and when she falls back on her foot, sorry, I'm French, right? I'm doing my best. That's why nobody can pronounce my name, and Varun said JP, which is fine.
It's true. I couldn't pronounce it yesterday. So,
when she falls back on her feet, you would normally feel this physically. So I contacted a company called Subpac, and what this does, it's actually transducers that transmit frequencies, very low frequencies to your body. So from 30 hertz to about 130 hertz, you really feel the impact in your body. So that's for the activation of Jurassic World, that's what we did. So there's, of course, it's about multimodality. So when you have vision, it's one thing. When you have spatialized audio, it's crazy through the roof. When you add smell, when you add other senses, it's, you can get really far, I think, in terms of delivering very high immersion. One thing I'd like to try is bone conduction. When we speak, when we talk, and we know it's us talking and not someone else because it resonates in our body, what if we could use bone conduction with headphones to transmit those frequencies to the body? You could simulate, while being a viewer, being someone else that speaks. That could be pretty crazy. If you know how to do this, let me know.
It actually raises an interesting point about who you are as the viewer or your character, and what can audio and the technology actually help in communicating who you are within that space. But I think if we just dial back down, a lot of the creative stuff that can happen with the medium depends on the tools and the technology. It's a two-way process. They cannot exist separately. So at a very base level, it's a simple concept of using spatialized and non-spatialized audio simultaneously. As JP illustrated with the LeBron James project, using music to move from spatialized to non-spatialized to help bridge the sort of narrative arc is extremely useful. Sort of very base level spec. It's not just about having, hey, we've got some 3D audio in there, VR audio is done. It's about ensuring you've got the tools to enable that to happen, but also not use 3D audio at interesting times. It becomes a powerful mechanism in which you can create contrast within the experience. And what I find really interesting about cinematic VR is with film, you're working to a timeline. With cinematic VR experiences, you're working to a timeline and also adding depth to the timeline. You're working with space and time simultaneously. So an example of this could be adding audio effects in space. So we're not talking about spatialized 3D audio. It's about affecting areas of your mix in specific ways. Maybe adding a little low-pass filter to muffle the sounds in specific areas that the user is looking at or not. Or something that I find really interesting is focus control, being able to focus areas of the mix based on where you're looking or not looking. So a good example of that is New Wave, as JP mentioned, having those two characters, but actually just based on your head gaze and orientation, you can hear different things. And along with spatialized and non-spatialized audio, having this control is a baseline spec of what we need for this medium, because it enables a lot more control and creativity for everyone involved. And that can further be extended into other areas. So maybe a simple example could be you're in a space, you've got these two bands playing around you, but just using your gaze and looking around, you can get the mix to change and be a lot more subtle. Maybe get the vocals to be a bit louder, the drums to be a bit lower, or if you are right in the middle of an orchestra, to be able to look around. It doesn't have to be broad strokes, but it's always the subtle things that add up and make a huge difference. And that is a two-way process. And it's not just enabling tools and enabling sound designers to make it happen. It's moving that further up the chain. Directors, storytellers, everybody needs to be aware of the possibilities of audio and the possibilities of audio within this medium and what can be done with it. Because it's very much about writing a script to make use of such technology in a good way.
Absolutely. And I cannot stress this point enough. If there are sound designers or mixers in the room, there sure are. You've probably read this seminal article by famous sound designer Randy Tom, which is called Designing a Movie for Sound. If you haven't read it, it's a very short read, very enlightening. And I would go as far as saying that with VR, well, in this article, Randy Tom is asking directors to really involve sound people early on in the movie to basically make a better movie. But I think in VR, it's actually critical. It's such a new vocabulary that if you don't realize all the potential of audio to tell stories in VR, you're really going to miss out on what this medium can deliver.
And that is, again, as I mentioned, it's a two-way process. And the interesting thing and the exciting thing about this is that none of us have the answers. We're all learning. Everybody who's involved in VR has just been experienced for 2 years, and you're a veteran. It's a level playing ground, and it's a chance for all of us to actually explore the medium, and for the creative people involved to push the technologists and the technology to push creative people. And that's where the exciting future is. And for me personally, it's about bridging that gap between linear and interactive and not really treating them as two separate things. There's a lot of potential in bringing them together. I'm not sure how it's going to come together or the best way to bring them together. The only way we can do that is by working on great projects and coming up with problems or hitting major roadblocks and finding both creative and technological ways of dealing with the problem. So we were just sitting down together and throwing questions at each other, but thinking, so what is the future of this? What if we could do this? What if we could do that? And something that came up just between us was, what if this is just the first step for moving into augmented reality? We hear that quite often, VR is maybe the first step, but what does cinematic as a word mean in that for such experiences? We don't know. And something that is crucial is, how would our perceptual systems actually adapt to such mediums? What could we learn? What could we do? What could we end up doing differently? Simply because currently we're not used to such a thing, but we're all used to movies. It's taken a long time to get used to it. How long would it take for us to actually get used to these experiences and treat them as something that's a lot more normal than they are?
Absolutely. So when we get used to VR, you know, I'm sure since you guys are all early adopters, you've all went through this wonderful moment of having someone try VR for the first time and going, oh, wow, this is completely crazy. So perhaps the 4 or 5 minutes is maximum that first time. But when we get used to it, perhaps we'll want longer formats, who knows? And Varun was talking about what seems to be the holy grail of what people seem to want to achieve with cinematic VR is having a fully interactive environment. You can actually walk in any environment, talk to anybody, and perhaps this is where we want to go. But I think we still, as humans, want to be told stories. We still want to just go to bed, be very passive, and be told, do some binge watching. We'll still want to do it. So perhaps we want to go for very, very highly interactive virtual environments, but I think passive experiences can still deliver incredible content.
It's also this concept of moving beyond, or breaking down the linear storyline into multiple linear storylines, maybe based on gaze. Could you branch out the story into something else? Does everyone have a very different experience at the end of it? Lots of questions. And
yeah, like one thing I was saying, Varun, I'd like to explore is, let's just say you're in a bar. There's 5, 6 tables, and you're looking at a table over there. There seems to be an interesting discussion for the plot of the story that's been going on so far. And if you zoom for 5 seconds to that table, we actually give you that sound perspective. You can hear that discussion. You get superpowers. And perhaps that sort of opens a new branch in the story. I don't know. I'm sure each of you has at least one interesting thing they'd like to try with VR. So we just need to be brave and explore. And we need tools to explore them.
Oh, that's a good way to conclude it, I think. Yeah, so I don't think we know everything yet. And it's a conversation that needs to continue to happen at all levels, and all of us need to talk and share, and that's really the best way we can make the most of this medium. So, any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nicole Lazaro from Zio Design, ZioPlay, and I'm lead engineer on a game called Follow the White Rabbit. And we had a really, really experience where I was going to say, okay, yeah, now it's time to add some audio. And so I went and I, took some nice stereo mixes, got some nice John Williams soundtracks, just with sampling stuff. And what I found is that the game, which is kind of 2D and 3D mix, when I put that audio in, the music, some nice music stuff, it completely flattened the experience. It really dissolved my sense of presence, and I felt like I was watching a video game or watching a movie. And I went from soundtrack to soundtrack. I tried some binaural audio, and all of the space just completely collapsed. Have you experienced that? And do you have any idea of what might be going on?
To the 80 people, it's hard for us to understand clearly the questions. I would like to. Would you please? I'm sorry. I'll ask you to repeat.
Yeah. Okay. So
very.
Yeah. So very briefly, I'm lead engineer on a virtual reality game. I added a soundtrack, like a movie soundtrack, and even like the soundtrack.
What do you mean by a movie soundtrack?
Oh, so I added music. I added music like from the game Myst, which is one of my favorite because it's really spatial. And it seemed to compress, in the visual realm, it seemed to compress the world so that I was only watching a movie or I was only playing a traditional video game.
Okay, so basically you said you're adding stereo music to a fully spatialized gaming experience, and you feel it's flattening out the
flattening.
space?
It's just a turn around a single point. And so the scene had depth, but the audio seemed to compress it.
Oh, interesting. Well, that would probably a matter of mixing, or if you remove that soundtrack, do you feel you really have, do you deliver very immersive, spatialized audio? And is there a lot happening? Is there a lot of focus in the mix?
This was the only audio in the scene, so this was the only audio in the scene.
Okay.
And it was non-sourced, so it kind of felt.
Well, it's very much a design thing, because it's like the similarities. If you've got a really good audio mix, but then you add some visuals on it, it's really tough to know how it's going to work. So I personally haven't experienced this, and I think it's very much down to the actual mix and positioning of the sound.
Your question, though, brings a point, and we haven't talked about this. I'm sorry, I will diverge. But there's a question about loudness. In gaming, in cinematic VR, you'll see various specs. If you compress the mix a lot, and I talk in terms of dynamics, it can kill spatialization. Because obviously it's about distance, right? If someone is really far talking to you, but if sound is super compressed, it will break the sense of distance. So it has to do with the crafting of the mix, I would say.
Yeah, what we found the most effective is binaural stuff that had a very long spatial and there was motion through it. So like a car passing by, then my audio space started to match my visual space. Mm-hmm. Most stereo mixes kind of pull you into your head, so my audio was going into my head and then the visual was going out.
It's a fine balance.
Are we out of time? All right, okay.
Thank you very much.
Do we have time for more questions? Or? Okay.
Okay, so we can perhaps, if people want to ask questions, there's a space outside, right? You're more than welcome to talk with us. Thank you very much, everyone.